Welcome to the German-American Institute. We're glad you all found your way here for an amazing program tonight. A particularly warm welcome to our panelists, Steve Israel and Tom Davis. Thank you so much for being here tonight and making this possible. And also to Thomas Gijswijt, who's going to be the moderator of tonight's debate. Thomas will introduce the panelists, but there's not a lot of things that I can say about him except for the fact that at the university in Tübingen, he is pretty much the biggest expert on the political landscape of the US. So he is the person to moderate this debate. Thank you, Thomas. Basically, tonight's event is like a political Super Bowl, and with every Super Bowl, I think one of the main attractions is also the commercial break, and this is what I'm here for. I'm basically here to tell you about 2 or 3 events that we do before we start the main event. The German-American Institute, for those of you who are here for the very first time, our mission goal is to foster German-American relations, to increase the German-American friendship, and wherever possible, make encounters possible between Germans and Americans. We do that in many ways. We have language courses, we have an event program, we have a library. Let me point out 1 or 2. Tomorrow night, there's actually going to be a quiz night here at the d.a.i. Where you can show off your trivia knowledge. On February 6th, there's going to be a concert with Noah Guthrie, who many of you might know from the TV show Glee, but we're being told he's actually even better live. And for those of you who during tonight's debate think, wow, this is really fascinating, I want to learn more about American politics, the best way to do that is, of course, to travel with us to Washington, D.C. We're offering a trip starting September 28, and we'll spend 1 week in Washington, D.C. right before the elections, and we're going to talk to political experts, journalists, and just figure out how people feel about the upcoming elections. And if you don't want to wait so long, and your focus is not necessarily so much on politics, but also on the many cultures in the US, we're also offering a trip to New York in May already. You'll find the flyers back there. And I mentioned the Super Bowl. We're actually going to do a live screening of the Super Bowl. If you're up at 12 p.m. 2 weeks from today on Sunday, that's always a lot of fun because a lot of Americans attend. And we're doing that in cooperation with the local football team, the Red Knights. That was the commercial break. And now to the main event. Thomas.
Thank you very much. I was expecting Taylor Swift or someone for the commercial break, but thank you, Felix. It's good to see so many of you here and many more also live on YouTube. This is a hybrid event. It's such a pleasure because much of what we hear in Europe about the state of politics in the United States is about polarization, about gridlock, about hyper-partisanship. And here we are, 2 former longtime members of Congress, 1 a Republican, 1 a Democrat, join us here together to show us another side of the United States. At least I'm hoping and assuming that we will have a civilized discussion here tonight. Since they've managed to survive teaching a course at a university together on US politics, I think it's a safe assumption to make. In the spirit of bipartisanship, I'll introduce both distinguished guests here tonight together. Tom Davis, Republican, Steve Israel, Democrat, have served multiple terms in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., representing the great states of Virginia and New York. Both have reached a host of different leadership positions within their parties and in different congressional committees, including chairman of the National Republican Congressional Committee and chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. After retiring from Congress, Tom Davis in 2008 and Steve Israel in 2017, they've continued to follow US politics closely. Tom Davis as a lawyer in Washington, D.C. and as a distinguished professor at George Mason University, professor of public policy at the Scar School of Policy and Government, to be precise. And Steve Israel, both as a writer of political novels, 2 until now, and as director of the Institute for Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell University. Now, we're in book-loving Tübingen here tonight, so I should also mention that he opened a bookstore on Long Island, Oyster Bay, not long ago, called Theodore's, named after former President Teddy Roosevelt. And maybe we'll find out tonight whether this is part of his recovery strategy after serving in Washington for so long. So please join me in welcoming Tom Davis and Steve Israel here tonight. Warm round of applause. I'd also like to say a warm thank you to the State Department and the good people of the American Consulate in Frankfurt, the embassy in Berlin, the other consulates that have been involved. They are really doing a very intensive tour of Germany with stops already in Berlin, Leipzig, Munich, Stuttgart. I think Frankfurt will be next. And so it's the real deal here for these 2 gentlemen. The plan for tonight is to start with the three of us having a conversation for about 30 minutes or so to get us going. Then we'll open up for questions to you guys in the public. Questions on the YouTube channel are also possible. Please post them in the comment section. And Sophia Kumner here, who's looking very professional there behind all those screens, will bring those questions to us as well. So that's the plan for tonight. I look forward to it. Maybe let's just start with the latest news from the Republican primaries. We've had Iowa, we've had New Hampshire now, and it seems to be over. Donald Trump is going to be the candidate to run for the presidency for the Republican Party. Am I right? Any scenario in which he is not?
I can give you a scenario where it doesn't work, but it's unlikely. I mean, at this point, the next primary is going to be in South Carolina, Nikki Haley's home state, where Trump is heavily favored. And then the next week after that, you have half the delegates being picked. So something in that intervening period would have to occur that would disrupt Donald Trump's momentum. And as we've seen in the past, nothing seems to disrupt his momentum when he gets going. He went through the Inside Hollywood episode in his first campaign. He's been through numerous indictments, and nothing seems to have slowed his momentum. This is about basically the direction of the country. The country's very closely divided. And at this point, it looks like he's the leader of a movement, and nothing's going to stop him from doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Let me add one other thing.
Yes.
Steve was chairman of the Democratic Campaign Committee. I was chairman of the Republican Campaign Committee. But we both left Congress undefeated and unindicted, something that we're very, very proud of.
It's a triumph. It's a triumph.
Well, I maybe can add then that I've also Googled and learned that Bill Clinton called Steve Israel one of the most thoughtful people in Congress. And I'm wondering, well, was that meant as a compliment?
I said the bar is very low. I asked him, have you been watching C-SPAN at all? Do you know what's happening in Congress?
All right. From the Democratic perspective, the Biden team is, of course, looking closely at what is happening in Iowa and in New Hampshire. Any information that might stem them a little bit hopeful, despite the fact that Trump seems to be winning everything pretty easily?
Well, Tomas, first, thank you for moderating, and thank you to the German-American Institute for the incredible work you do. I know I listened very carefully about plans to bring you to New York and Washington. I urge you to participate in that. You know, politics is all about wheeling and dealing. So I'm going to make a deal with my friend Tom Davis right now. If you go to Washington, he will treat you to a lavish dinner because he lives. And if you go to New York, he will treat you to a lavish dinner. He will fly up. No, I do hope you can make it, and we would love to host you at some events, both in New York and Washington. Look, I think as polarized as we are, and as difficult as it seems to be in reaching any kind of consensus on basic facts, there is at least one fact that Tom and I agree on, that Joe Biden and Donald Trump agree on, and that is that the electorate in the United States is polarized. About 40% of the electorate is planning to vote for Joe Biden. About 40% of the electorate is planning to vote for Donald Trump. They're locked in, despite the fact that 2/3 of the electorate would like different choices. 80% of the electorate knows who it's going to vote for. What is really important to both campaigns, the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign, is the 20% who are left, who have not yet made up their minds. These are called swing voters. These are people, many of whom voted for Obama and then Trump and then Biden, who could either vote for Trump again or Biden. And they live in the 7 battleground states. You all know we have an electoral college, that New York is going to vote for Joe Biden no matter what, and Alabama is going to vote for Donald Trump no matter what. It's those 7 battleground states that count. And so what Biden is looking at and what Trump is looking at are the same subset of voters, that 20% in those states. And whatever you may hear now about polling and about the economy and about crime and about democracy doesn't matter. What matters is what those 20% of voters in those 7 states are thinking about in 10 months from now when they begin to make judgments on who they're going to vote for.
All right. Well, here, New Hampshire may have given some helpful information to the Biden campaign in that quite a few independents didn't seem to lean towards voting for Trump, and Nikki Haley did quite well amongst those voters. Trouble for Haley is that she's not doing very well amongst Republican voters, and it seems to be a Republican primary that she needs to win. All right, let's maybe take a brief step back. You've both served long and distinguished careers in Congress. Sort of thinking back to your sort of early experiences all the way up to the Congress of today, what are sort of 1 or 2 of the key changes in how Capitol Hill is functioning or not functioning that you would identify based on your own experiences, but perhaps also in the period since then?
Well, I mean, Washington today, it starts with the voters. Steve represented a district that leaned Republican, and he was a Democrat. I represented a district that leaned Democrat, and I was a Republican. Voters used to vote for the person. We used to say they voted for the number on the jersey. Now they're voting for the color of the jersey. People are voting party, not person. And that's having effect on the whole political process. So that when members come to Washington at this point, voters act like this is a parliamentary system in terms of how they're voting. Congressmen are behaving that way today. What do I mean? I mean, we're a balance of power structure. We are not a parliamentary system. We have supposed to have an independent Congress, independent judiciary, and executive branch with checks and balances. But today, the president's party in Congress doesn't act independently. They're an appendage of the executive branch. They're going to protect their president. They're going to under-investigate any misdeeds that go on there. And the minority party is no longer a minority shareholder in government. They act like the opposition party, like you would. Impeachments used to be rare. Now they're becoming more like no confidence votes. As it's just gotten more polarized. 80 to 85% of the members, the only race that matters is their race for the nomination, the primary election, of which only their party generally participates. That means they hew their time, their attention, and their voting records toward their base voters. Their base voters are true believers. They don't reward compromise, they punish compromise. And so you end up in this situation with these one-party constituencies where it's very difficult to work across party lines without being punished in the nomination process for your parties. Steve and I represented districts where they were very swing districts that leaned kind of the other way. When we worked to compromise, there'd be some reward for us. You don't see that anymore. Secondly, the way people receive their news today. Everybody's in their own set of facts. We like to say people do not tune in for information, they tune in for affirmation. They get the news that affirms their worldviews, that validates their worldviews. And so you've got constituencies over here with one worldview that are getting one set of facts and news that are vote-dominating primaries, and another group over here. Just makes compromise very, very difficult. I think that's a major change that we've seen just fairly recently. Steve?
Oh, I completely agree, and perhaps I can help make the point with a story that happens to be true about Tom Davis. When I was elected, as Tom said, from a Republican district that no Democrat was ever believed to be able to win. And when I got to Congress, I feared him. I didn't want to make eye contact with him, didn't want him to know who I was, and that was because he was the chairman of the House Republican Campaign Committee, and it was his job to kill me politically. That was his job. This is the guy who had the money, the will, and the wherewithal to defeat me in a Republican district. And then I became the chairman of the Democratic Campaign Committee. My job was to make him miserable. My job was to defeat Republicans and elect Democrats and hope that he was so miserable that he would leave Congress. But the day after every election, we would find ways of working together, because there comes a time when you have to govern. There comes a time when you have to put the politics and take off the jerseys and get back to red, white, and blue in the United States and find ways to govern. We were able to do that. We were able to legislate back then. But by the time we left Congress, unindicted and undefeated, it was harder than ever. Fewer and fewer members of Congress were willing to compromise, willing to govern. And it's for the reasons that Tom mentioned. Number one, there were fewer moderate districts. You got punished at back home if you compromised. If you had a very Republican district and you compromised with Steve Israel, the voters would take it out on you. How dare you work with a Democrat? And if you had a very Democratic district and you compromised with Tom Davis, the voters would take that out on you. How dare you work with a Republican? Final point on this. When I went to Congress in 2000, there were about 125 congressional districts out of 435 where members of Congress needed to compromise because their constituents wanted it. Today, on this very day, there were between 25, 30, if you want to be really, you want to give it the benefit of the doubt, 40, but no more than that. All of the other districts punish people who want to govern. They don't want government in those districts. They want ideology. They don't want to move forward. They want to move the country further left or further right. And that is a phenomenon that began in 2008 and has continued, amplified, accelerated until now.
All right, we have a new Republican speaker in the House of Representatives, someone we weren't fully aware of here.
When you say new, do you mean in the last hour?
Good question. Because, of course, his predecessor, Kevin McCarthy, made a somewhat fateful deal with a group of difficult Republican members of the House that any of them could basically kick him out or have a vote to kick him out. And soon after that deal was made, this happened. Tom, the new speaker, Mike Johnson, what do we need to know about him? Will he have any of an easier job than his most recent predecessors? What is your take on the Republican Speaker of the House?
Well, it's not an easy job. You have a very small margin, 2-3 seat margin at this point. There is a special election in New York, right in your old district.
My old district.
That will be coming up in early March, but both parties will spend $10 million on trying to win it. Democrats win it, they don't capture the House, but it gets them a vote closer, and it's kind of a signal to the rest of the country in terms of where things are going. I know Mike Johnson. He is from Shreveport, Louisiana. He's an intelligent person. People say, well, he's very conservative. He's from Shreveport, Louisiana. What do you expect? That doesn't necessarily mean that's the kind of speaker he's going to be, because the speaker has to preside over the Republican conference and over the whole House. Mike Johnson is a very able person, considers himself a constitutional lawyer. He is a Christian, and he wears it. He's very open about that. Kevin McCarthy was thrown out because he wanted to keep the government open, and he put forward a bill in the House floor that had a majority of the House, but didn't have a majority of his caucus, because the government hadn't funded the government for the year, so they passed what's called a continuing resolution. And he put that on to keep the government open, and some of the Republicans were offended. They filed a motion to take him out, and that carried with a handful of 8 Republicans and all the Democrats. Democrats were complicit in this too. Why not? McCarthy was the biggest fundraiser for the Republicans, and it caused mischief within the Republican conference, and it basically shut down the House for 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. I knew Kevin McCarthy. I knew him when he was in the State House in California. And his number was up. We just had some rabid people that get on cable TV and represent a constituencies that'll never be happy, and they're just anti-establishment. Johnson's going to come up to the same decisions. He really doesn't have he doesn't have many options in the scheme of things, but to make some compromises along the way without looking completely ridiculous. He's got a little more cachet with conservatives because he comes out of that conservative wing of the party. My suspicion in talking, Steve, to some of your members is that they may not vote en masse to take him out if there's a motion to vacate the chair. That members won't vote for him, but they can abstain, which raises it makes it harder to take him out. He just doesn't have the baggage on him that McCarthy did, and he's not the prodigious fundraiser McCarthy is. So, and he's also a caricature that they can run against. So why not? But it's still very tough. We still our federal budget year began October 1st, and Congress hasn't passed a budget. And they won't have to. The next date is March 1st and March 7th to fund the government through the 12 appropriation bills. They may not even reach that. For those of us that are around government, we never funded on time. The last time we funded the government on time in all the agencies was 1996. And we only did it that year because we'd shut the government down twice the year before, and we were going into an election cycle. So Congress isn't very efficient even on its best days. But this has been total dysfunction. I think Republicans pay a price for this next November in those potentially these handfuls. But Johnson's got his hands full. But I think the die is cast. You got a president and a Senate. The only other thing I'd add, and this will get to the question of funding for Ukraine and the like, is I do think the Senate is not going to try to jam him on some of this stuff. They want to give him some room to maneuver. But it's a very, very difficult job, no matter who is speaker. And I think Johnson he had fewer enemies in the caucus, and that's why he got elected.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about the Biden administration. His approval rating hovers around 40%, which isn't great if you're coming into an election year and are running for re-election. Steve, if you'd have to sort of grade him on his first term, what are maybe some of the major accomplishments, weaknesses overall? What grade would you give President Biden and his team?
Well, shock of all shocks, I'm a Democrat who was appointed by the president to a presidential commission. I was active in his first campaign, will be active in his next campaign. So brace yourselves now. I give him an A+, and I know that may astound you.
I'll ask Tom the same question.
Yeah,
so go ahead.
Tom, we may have a gentle disagreement on that. Look, when you go back to where the country was when he was elected, the pandemic, the shutdowns, people without jobs, hotels that weren't open, restaurants that couldn't open, an economy that was on the verge of collapse, industries that were spiraling because of the pandemic, foreign policy, a NATO that was fragmented, questions about America's commitments to its allies, including Germany, instability and chaos, and contrasted to where we are now, I think he deserves very good grades. Do we all have disappointments in various aspects of his policy? My wife is here. She has disappointments in various aspects of my policies. That's just human nature. but I believe that he deserves good marks. Now, here's the problem. The question is, well, then why is he at 40% if he did such a good job, Steve? And the problem is this. First of all, the electorate is polarized. There are now studies that if you are a Democrat, you believe that the economy is booming, and if you are a Republican, you believe that the economy is in a recession in the same household. The same family see things differently. And the second issue is this. My party, God bless the Democrats, we love data. We love statistics. We love to look at today's New York Times story, giving all of the statistical reasons why the economy did better. There was a jobs report or economic report that came out this morning that proved that the economy is doing better. You cannot feel data. You cannot feel statistics. And most voters still feel that they're having a hard time paying the bills, that prices are too high, even though the economists will say inflation is going down, that there's still too much unemployment. You ask the average American what the unemployment rate is, and they'll tell you it's in double digits. It's actually historically low.
3.5%.
But 3.5%. But they'll tell you it's in double digits. Until those voters feel that the economy is getting better, you're not going to see much of an increase in Joe Biden's favorability. And not only that, but it doesn't matter how they feel about it today. It goes back to what I said earlier. How do they feel next October about the economy? And if they feel that the economy is better, then I think Joe Biden has a real path, despite the fact that he's low on the polls. One other thought on this. Tom and I love political history. We love boring people to death with political history. But Joe Biden is not the first incumbent president to be polling miserably in the January before the election and then winning. There's time to improve. It is all going to be a function of what is happening to that 20% in those 7 battleground states in 10 months from now.
All right, we'll get back to that. I think Obama was polling at the low 40s around this time.
A little higher,
in
little higher
2012.
than Biden is.
All right.
Yeah.
And for the record, I don't give Biden an A+. Just want to put that on the
All right, well, why not?
Well, any number of reasons. First of all, for every tax dollar they collect, 40 cents of that's going to pay interest on the national debt. National debt has skyrocketed. We're running $2 trillion in debt a year. The economy is doing at a macro level very well because it's basically kited checks, where basically the government is funneling money into the economy. Secondly, the border is a mess. We've had literally millions of people stream across the border and have disappeared into the United States. We have no idea where they are. In American cities, they are shutting down hotels. They are taking budgets that were going to be used for police and schooling, and they have to use it now to pay for these migrants because he abandoned some of Trump's policies of trying to hold people at the border so they could make their asylum claims. It was called the Stay in Mexico policy. They quit building the wall and, in fact, tore down part of the wall that he had built. Yesterday, with the help of the U.S. Supreme Court, Texas had put some barbed wire across an area that migrants were going through illegally. And they took that down to allow them to come. It's almost been a welcome in. I believe in immigration. America is a country of immigrants. It's what's made us very different from any other country on earth. And immigrants have risen and made some of the most important contributions. But people need to go through the gate, not over the wall. You need a high wall, but a wide gate. We're a welcoming country. But it's not fair to people who've waited in line forever to get in line, have played by the rules, for another group to come crashing across the border when we don't know who they are. We don't have any background checks. We know a number of them we've found have come off the terrorist watch list. And the administration has done, in my opinion, very little about that. And of course, we've had inflation. Inflation has now leveled off a bit, but people don't forget that last year it was at 10%, and that 10% stays in terms of the prices they're paying at the grocery store. And they did this despite the fact that I think even Larry Summers, a former Democratic Secretary of Treasury, said, you do these kind of things, you overspend like this, you're going to get inflation. So that's why I don't give them an A+. Look, it's a tough job. I think he has done some things very well. It's not all bad. I think his biggest political problem, though, is not that. It's just the fact that he's an older guy, and there have been a number of flubs and stuff on TV that kind of accentuate his age and his ability, and I think to a lot of Americans, that is a concern. Donald Trump's almost as old, but Donald Trump doesn't quite have the same. He appears to be a little more fluent when he's on. They both have issues. Donald Trump doesn't always stay to the script, as you know, and tends to go off to the side, and both of them do. But I think for those reasons, I don't give him an A+. Of course, I don't have an appointment from him either, and I don't have an appointment from Trump, so the worst he could do is to bust me to precinct captain. So I'm not worried about telling you what I think about it, but I don't think Biden deserves an A.
Just
Yeah,
one respectful difference with Tom. Not on his grade. I wouldn't expect him to say anything differently. But I think he and I would both agree that, in fairness, one of the reasons that our debt is so high and our deficits are so large is Donald Trump. That deficits are aggregate. They're cumulative, and no one can look at the Trump administration and say he brought down deficits. That he reduced spending and brought in revenues. So deficits are Tom's favorite line that I love to steal from him, because that's what politicians do, is if you have a low tolerance for hypocrisy, you should get out of politics. Both parties spend. Both parties have been incapable of dealing with deficit and debt, and both parties enjoy blaming the other party for that problem.
Yeah. Deficits only matter when the other party's in Congress, we like to say, right?
Maybe jumping on the age issue, because I saw a lot of you here in the audience sort of nodding along to, yeah, he has a problem, because he is a little old. He's 81. We did have a chancellor here in Germany, by the way. If you're in contact with the Biden team, Konrad Adenauer won re-election with 81. His campaign slogan, keine Experimente, no experiments. Maybe something Biden could try. Who knows? But anyway, how can he overcome this? What can he do in the upcoming campaign, apart from jogging onto the stage as he is wont to do? How can Biden deal with this, sort of combined also with why did he decide to run again?
Well, I'll make 2 points. One is I used to believe that age was a very serious issue and a major factor in determining my vote in campaigns. And now that I'm old, I think that age doesn't really matter. I think it's just, people should be judged based on merits, not chronology. Look, a campaign's imperative is to find the right message that addresses its vulnerabilities. And so if the Biden campaign assesses that those 20% in those 7 states are shifting away from Joe Biden because they think he's too old, I can guarantee you that the campaign will find ways on television, on radio, on social media, streaming, knocking on doors to correct that perception. Campaigns are about perception correction. The more important thing I would say is that for those, and by the way, the nodding of heads is not unique to the German-American Institute. It happens frequently in the United States when people think about Biden's age. More important question is, what would happen if Joe Biden himself decided, I'm too old and I'm going to step aside? This is very important. Tom and I have talked about this. I think one of the most important questions in politics is, then what? It's vital in any political calculation to think a few steps ahead. Then what? So give me 1 minute and let's go through the scenario and why it would be a horrific idea for Joe Biden to step aside. Let's say he decides, I'm out. Then who runs for president? Then what? Kamala Harris, the vice president. And I'm looking at some right here in this room, and I see it in America. People say, well, then she needs to step aside. Really? You're going to tell the first African-American woman in the history of the United States to be vice president that she needs to step out, step aside, move over? Then what? Well, the African-American vote that is indispensable to Democrats just implodes. We cut off a path for victory. let's say that Kamala Harris decides that she would love to be the U.S. ambassador to Germany and doesn't want to be vice president anymore because as one Tom's the expert of political trivia, who said the vice presidency wasn't worth a warm pitcher of
Vice
spit?
President Marshall.
Vice President Marshall. Let's say Kamala Harris says, you know what, this
No,
job
there's
isn't
John
worth-
Nance Garner, excuse me.
Garner. This job isn't worth a warm pitcher of spit, so I'm leaving. Then what? Well, do you know what happens then? Then the Democratic Convention in August has to decide who's going to run for president and vice president. Now, the last time this actually happened in American history was in 1968 when President Lyndon Baines Johnson went on television and said, I'm stepping aside. I don't want to run for re-election. And then what? It went to an open convention that exploded. And I mean violently exploded. If you Google this, or some of you may remember this, there were riots in the streets, police were beating young people were beating police, and a convention is about establishing the narrative. The narrative coming out of the Chicago Convention was the Democrats are lawless and disorderly, and Richard Nixon, who arguably was in a very weak position at that point, what did he run on? Law and order. And then what? He won, the Democrats lost. We're not interested in repeating that experiment. So as perhaps difficult as the issue may be for Joe Biden, it's much better than the then what alternatives.
And let me add, that the election ultimately is about the direction of the country. Both candidates, Trump and Biden, have their personal foibles. I think everybody recognizes it. We can get into it in the question and answer. It's not just an age issue with Trump. It's the fact that he tends to pop off sometimes and offend different groups. But ultimately, to the American public, this is a race about which direction do we want the country to go. And America is undergoing some of the same challenges that Germany and the rest of the world is with that. What are the challenges of globalization? What are the chances of migration, wealth disparity? What are these? And in the United States, what's happened is, as the United States has moved and progressed forward in some areas, there is an element in the population, I call them the progressives, who say, you're not going fast enough. We need to make these changes now. But there's an element at the other end that their status is completely threatened. They're not sure where they're staying. They're saying, wait a minute, well, we're not moving. And it's not just economic, it's social. The economic news on a macro level was good today at a 3% growth. But in some parts of the country, there's still no opportunity. And that's really a base vote for Donald Trump in many areas. So ultimately, this issue is going to be about the direction of the country. And we are very, very bitterly divided on that point. These other issues will play in the middle. They affect that 20% of the electorate that he talked about. But despite the fact that both of these guys have glaring weaknesses, it's which direction do you want the country to go? And that's where the disagreement comes, and that's where the race will ultimately be decided.
All right, before we open up for questions from the audience, maybe one final question that I'm really curious about, whether you have any inside information on this for us to share, either of you. I keep wondering why there weren't more Republicans in the aftermath of Trump's big election lie and the storming of the Capitol who used the opportunity to get rid of him, either through the impeachment or through making him unqualified to run for public office ever again. It seemed such a great opportunity. Why didn't more of them do this? Do any of you have a good answer to that?
Well, let me give you two stories. One is I called a number of members before January 6th to counsel them, saying this is a career vote if you vote to certify or not to certify. I'll just give you two instances. One was a very able member from a Republican district, PhD, knowledgeable, more moderate, and he said, Tom, if I vote to certify, if I don't vote not to certify in at least one state, I'm going to have a primary, and I'm not sure I can handle it. And I may be through. I said, I got it, I understand. I talked to another member who is now the chairman of a major committee, and he was on the floor on January 6th, by the way, was afraid for his life. He voted to certify, but he's afraid for his life there on January 6th. 2 days later, back in his hometown, he's in the Walmart, and this woman walks up to him. He thinks she's going to say, Congressman, are you okay? You know what she says? Do you think they learned their lesson? The fact of the matter is these members go home, they're worried about their primary voters right now have a strong loyalty to the movement Donald Trump started and to the leader of that movement. And standing up to Donald Trump in an open way has been a way of political suicide for many of these members. Ask Liz Cheney. Went from the most popular politicians in Wyoming to maybe getting 30% in her primary race after she spent millions of dollars and came from a great Republican brand name. It is pure survival at this point. That's why. If you go in the cloakroom, I think all of us were astounded at the way he handled the election. I just call him a sore loser. Al Gore lost a 5-4 Supreme Court decision, had every right to complain and take it to the streets, and he walked away for the good of the country. Richard Nixon did the same thing in 1960. Donald Trump didn't. That's not who he is. This is a brawler from the Queens in New York, and he brought that style to the White House. It's not anything Washington is used to. But for the people who see him leading a movement of people who have felt neglected for a long time, it becomes insurmountable. And he brought a lot of new people into the Republican Party, chased some out, but he brought a lot of new people in who said, we have a champion in Donald Trump. And I think a lot of members who come from, I represented the wealthiest district in the country. It's certainly not a Trump district. But in terms of survival, you either get on the steamroller or you become part of the pavement. And I think that's what happened.
All right. I think it's time for questions from the audience now. Felix Weinmann here has a microphone that we need to use because otherwise the good people on YouTube will not hear your question. So who would like to go first? We have two in the back.
On German radio, we got to know that there's another candidate running. His last name is Kennedy. What about him?
Well, I think because you have Trump and Biden are so unpopular, you will have a proliferation of third-party candidates. Jill Stein was a Green Party candidate last time. She got like 1%. She'll run again. We have Cornel West, an African-American professor from Princeton and Harvard, is running to the left of Biden. You have Robert Kennedy Jr., who's garnered some support and interest. And you have another group called No Labels, who wants to run a centrist ticket with a Republican and a Democrat, one for president, one for vice president, so that voters who are dissatisfied with this choice will have other choices. So you don't have to get to 50% this time. That 40%, it's where do these independents and occasional voters go? Do they go to a third party? What happens? So yeah, Kennedy will take some votes, but there will be other people going after that dissatisfied vote than Robert Kennedy Jr. In my opinion, Kennedy Jr.'s biggest problem is, of course, he's got a great Democratic brand name, being part of the Kennedy family. But because of some of the public statements he's made on vaccinations and stuff, it's been a non-starter with a big part of the American left. And I think that has limited his upward mobility to tap into that. That's my own opinion. I'd be interested in what you have to say on that.
My wife and I know Bobby Kennedy, and it's sad to see what's happened with him. On the broader issue of an alternative third party, the beautiful thing about the American people is that they all love an alternative until they have an alternative, until they actually see the alternative. So right now, Biden and Trump are running against a third party. We don't know what that party stands for, what it stands against. We don't know who's running for president or vice president. They are running against a phantom. But phantoms will always be filled in during the course of a campaign. And I can assure you that if the Trump campaign, once these third-party candidates are on the ballot and running, if the Trump campaign assesses that they are taking votes away from the Trump campaign, they will define that third party. They will take them down. And if the Biden campaign assesses that those third-party candidates are cutting into its margin, then the Biden campaign will define the third party and take them down. And so it's just too early to make any kind of judgments as to whether a third party is going to be viable. However, I think Tom is right that if ever there was kind of the environment and the atmosphere for a willingness to consider a third party in the American electorate, it is now, until that third party is defined.
I'm reminded of a poll at one point. Colin Powell was one of the most exalted people in American politics. But as soon as you tell people his stand on abortion and guns, those numbers disappear very quickly. So that's the way it is in politics, is that it becomes very polarized very quickly. Independents have never gone anywhere in American politics. They've gone somewhere, but they've never been able to win. Ross Perot got 19% in 1992, and he was polling in the high 30s at one point, and then he dropped out of the race, got back in, claimed his toaster was bugged. It got really goofy, but you had, at that point, Bush and Clinton, and the public wasn't sure about them for different reasons. But catching lightning in a bottle, which is really what the independent candidates would have to, hard to do, not impossible to do, but I think Steve is right. Historically, it's difficult, and we have an electoral vote system. So winning nationally doesn't help if you don't carry specific states. And the way this works and the way you target states and the like just make it very, very difficult.
On the other hand, in an election where a couple of thousand votes in 3 or 4 states might make the difference in the Electoral College, someone like Robert Kennedy could be a threat to Biden, I suppose. And
Sure,
I guess a lot of his funding is coming from Trump supporters and Republicans.
Well, from an alienated class, because Robert Kennedy talks to them. And you have a class of people in America, they're not liberals, they just feel alienated from government and neglected. And I think Robert Kennedy is a vessel for some of these people to show their disapproval. Trump's vote in 2016 was a big middle finger to the American establishment. I mean, that was a lot of his vote. He overcame, if you will, if you go back to some of the issues he had during the campaign, well, how could this guy stand up to this? A conventional candidate could not. A movement is hard to stop. And as I said before, the effects of globalization, of this in-migration, which has been huge and has played havoc in many parts of America, wealth disparity, if the political classes aren't addressing that appropriately, you're going to find people that feel their status threatened and are hurt by this. They'll go in strange ways, and Trump was able to tap into that.
Yes, thank you. So my name is Lukas, master student here in Tübingen, Master of Education, Political Science and German Linguistics. I'm also reserve officer in the German artillery. I have a little sister. She's a specialist in the tank troops, has an 8-year contract. I have a brother-in-law, also specialist, also in the tank troops, has a 12-year contract. And we're talking a lot about the elections and a lot about NATO. Because when Donald Trump was president, he said NATO is obsolete. He said we should leave NATO. He said we should bring our troops back from Germany to the US. And it is a fact that Germany has a great dependency on the American military. So as our German Lieutenant General Mais, the head of German army, said, wir sind blank. It's like we are basically naked. Yeah? And it is a fact that at the end of the decade, Russia will attack NATO states. Everybody says that. Every think tank, our German Ministry of Foreign Affairs,
defense minister just stated that.
The Polish also says this. So Trump is a big threat to us. So because what President Putin does, he's gambling. He's waiting for President Trump to invade the Baltic states. And then we are in big trouble. So my question is, what is Donald Trump's plan for NATO? Will he leave NATO? Will he defend Europe or will he not? And what is Joe Biden's plan for NATO, especially for NATO in Europe?
Can I go first? Because mine is easy.
Please, go ahead. Yeah, you got the easy one.
I got the easy one. What is Joe Biden's plan? If Joe Biden is reelected, he will see that result as a validation and endorsement of his foreign policies, his approach to NATO, his support for multilateral alliances, his support for collective security agreements. And so you will see consistency and constancy in U.S. foreign policy. He will continue to work to revitalize, rebuild, enhance NATO. He will continue to support maximum funding for Ukraine. He will not allow Ukraine to be threatened under his watch. He will continue to support the special and indispensable relationship between the United States and Germany and other allies. So you won't see much of a difference. In fact, you may see an enhancement of the current portfolio on foreign policy and national security issues in a Biden administration. Now, I'm going to sit back and listen to Tom tell us what's going to happen if Donald Trump is reelected.
Well, let me start by saying when you had the Obama-Biden administration and Putin went into Crimea, what did America do? Nothing. That should have been a symbol that, okay, we can take advantage of these guys. He didn't come back into Ukraine under Trump, did he? He waited till Trump was out, Biden is back in, and came back in. America was late to the table at that point in giving Ukraine what they needed. If anything, we owe the Ukrainians a great debt of gratitude for the suffering they've undergone, with how they stood up to Soviet troops. And I will tell you this, the vast majority of Republicans and Democrats in Congress want to fund Ukraine, and that money will come. It's been held up over a dispute with the border, and we think it'll get worked out in the next few weeks. But I don't know that if Trump were still in the White House, Putin would have felt whatever threat or would have gone in, because Trump you don't know what he'll do from day to day. And I think the calculation on that, given the relationship, is I'm not sure what this guy will do. But with Biden, you kind of knew what would happen. We didn't pull out of NATO under Trump. Trump has been very clear that he thinks that some of the countries over here have been given not a free ride, but America has been carrying the bulk in Europe, and that Europe needs to do more for itself, because there's domestic pressure to do that from Americans who say, you're spending all this money overseas, but what about us? You've left us behind. And it was those Americans that are looking to say, why are we sending this money abroad, building troops in Europe when we have our own problems on the border and we can't put troops across the border to defend the border? So I think he's reacted to that. I don't see any evidence myself that he'll pull out of NATO, but that I think he would like to make sure that we get more contributions from some of the other NATO countries. Pulling out of NATO is also complicated on the president acting alone. You have a Senate in the United States to do most of these foreign policy issues. You need 60 votes in the Senate. He's not going to have that. Biden doesn't have that. Getting 60 votes in a closely divided country is very, very difficult. So for all of the discussion we see about Donald Trump's going to do this, he's going to, we have a system of checks and balances that holds pretty firm, and it's been tested. But I don't see the threat that you do. But of course, I'm not in the German army and listen to the German press the way you do either. But I don't think there's any danger of pulling out of NATO.
All right, we have questions from the YouTube channel.
Yes, exactly. There is one question. How do you think a second term for Trump will differ from the first one, regarding him being a potential danger for the American democracy?
Well, I'll take the bullet on that. Right now, you have Democratic secretaries of states in states across the country trying to take Donald Trump off the ballot unilaterally, basically saying, we think he was part of an insurrection, he shouldn't. This is unprecedented in American history. You have this independent group, No Labels, coming on, Democratic secretaries of state trying to deny them access to the ballot. That's the ultimate voter suppression in my mind. We think voters ought to have their say. President has 91 indictments, all from Democratic district attorneys. So if anybody is undermining democracy, it's not just Trump, it's the Democrats are, I think, making their fair contribution as well. Let me we'll say one other thing and get back historically. In 2005, it was a close election between John Kerry and George W. Bush. Bush won the majority of the vote narrowly, and he won the Electoral College by carrying Ohio. He carried Ohio by 100,000 votes. When it came to certification vote between the House and the Senate, 31 Democrats voted not to certify Ohio. And so Congress had to go back into session and hold another vote and come back to certify that. But 31 Democrats voted, we're not going to certify this election, which would have, if it were counted, could have overturned the election. Nobody in the press said anything about it. In fact, some of these members were applauded because they were standing up and making a point about voting rights for African Americans that had stood in long lines. Fast forward to 2021, and you read the manifesto by House Republicans who were questioning a couple of the states. They were making the same point. They were basically saying, look, this was an election during a pandemic. We've had voter rules that have been in place in these states that have been voted by state legislatures, and these rules were changed unilaterally in some cases, without approval by the state legislature on absentee ballots, drop boxes, mail-in ballots, things that in many cases Republicans felt led to questionable activity. And they were just making the same point in these very closely contested states. They weren't going to overturn the election, but they voted not to certify the first time out. It would have come back for a full congressional vote at the end, so it really had no danger in doing that. But to make the same kind of point, and the press goes ballistic. Why'd they go ballistic? Because you had the crowd march on the Capitol, incited by President Trump, which I think was the wrong thing to do. And we didn't have enough policemen, National Guard, the kind of thing we've had for many other protests at the Capitol. They broke through the ranks and ransacked the Capitol. It's a sad day for the country, I can tell you. As a former member, it looked like the Visigoth sacking Rome. Those people are being prosecuted as they should be, and we should come down hard on them. But when you look at the question about democracy, I think it goes both ways. I think these rules have gotten flimsy, and each party is using whatever they can to advance their agendas. And I think some of the norms have not only been broken, but some of the guardrails we've had to democracy are being abused by both parties as they try to advance their agenda. And let me go to Steve if you want to.
Well, let me maybe just remark that there is a qualitative difference between a few dozen Democrats protesting an issue by not certifying an election that is clearly won by one candidate. The other candidate has admitted this, has conceded, and an election where the losing candidate refuses to accept this and actively tries to overturn an election result and tries to use Congress to accomplish this. That is a bit of a difference.
Well, it is a difference in magnitude, but when you talk about Congress certifying election results that were certified by the Secretary of State, that precedent was set by Democrats. That had stayed since we had not seen this since the election of 1876. So precedents are stubborn things. And when you start prosecuting presidents, don't think that there isn't retaliation somewhere down the line. And that's sad for America.
All right.
Well, may I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Tom and I do have a respectful disagreement on this. I worry deeply about what will happen to democracy and the norms of democracy in our institutions if Donald Trump is reelected. It animates me. It's one of the reasons that I remain as involved as I do. How many of you have heard of the historian and the theorist Robert Kagan, the author, the scholar? Well, I commend to your attention a piece he did recently called "Let's Face It, We're Heading Towards Dictatorship." Robert Kagan is not a liberal Democrat. He's actually a principled conservative, center-right analyst of foreign policy, national security. And he writes in this piece that he believes, and I agree with him, that if Donald Trump is elected, that we are looking at a very serious attack and assault on democracy. I'll give you a couple of examples on why I believe he's right. If you talk to folks who are close to Donald Trump, they will tell you that the problem with his first term wasn't that he went too far, it's that he didn't go far enough, that he was restrained by disloyalty, the disloyalty of what they call the deep state, which is another word for the civil service, the professional civil service, the disloyalty of secretaries of state or national security advisors or secretaries of defense who refused to do what he wanted to do. They're gone now. If President Trump is elected, he is going to impose a very strict loyalty test on the people who join him for a second administration. And I'm very deeply concerned that those folks represent some very dark and authoritarian impulses and will do whatever is necessary to break the rules, to violate the norms, to go around Congress, over Congress, under Congress, by intimidating and harassing and speaking in demagogic ways that have always resulted in the most chilling and darkest moments in history. So I do worry about what will happen with democracy in a second term.
Can I just respond to that? We're still a nation with a lot of checks and balances on this. Many of these things can't happen without congressional approval. You need 60 votes in the Senate for virtually everything that Kagan talked about that he wanted to do in terms of undermining the civil service and the like. I chaired the committee in Congress that oversees the civil service and has jurisdiction over the civil service. Civil service is hard to change. Presidents besides Trump have tried to change it. President Biden has been struck down by the courts several times in actions he has taken at the executive branch. Presidents have been constantly testing how they can advance their agendas through executive order and through regulatory agencies. This didn't start with Trump. This predates him, and it has moved on. Obama made this almost an art form as they go through, and the courts have dealt blow after blow to presidents that have tried to move outside this. I think these are scare tactics. They work. In fact, one of the Biden campaign aides, off the record, but was speaking to the pace, said, well, if things go bad on the economy, we're going to go full Hitler on Trump. That's what they're trying to do. I think it's a disservice to democracy to use that kind of language. Donald Trump's a lot of things, but he's not that. And he governed for 4 years. We know what that is. Unfortunately, if it weren't for January 6th, which I'm not going to apologize, which I'm not going to defend, but for that, it was a pretty successful administration, and then COVID hit. And COVID took down a lot of elected officials across the country, but the economy was going well. Things were going pretty well internationally.
All right.
We have another one from online. So you first, let's do you, then the online one, and then.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question on U.S. foreign policy, specifically on the situation regarding Ukraine. Both of you mentioned that U.S. foreign policy is not likely to change in its commitment to NATO, regardless of who will win the presidential election. However, I have doubts about the same thing about the U.S. commitment to Ukraine, and I would like to hear your opinion on how likely is continuous support, U.S. support for Ukraine with Donald Trump, as well as re-election of Joe Biden.
Go ahead. Yeah. Well, first of all, I think the majority of Republicans, I won't say the vast majority, the majority of Republicans certainly support aid to Ukraine. And Senator Mitch McConnell, the chairman of the head of the Republicans in the Senate, said, you know, we support funding Ukraine. We're going to find a vehicle to try to move this through the Senate and get it over to the House. There are some legitimate questions being asked. As this war comes to a stalemate stage right now, how long do we fund it? What's the strategy? I mean, what is winning this? If everybody remains intransigent, how much money can we send over there? And the Republicans have responded by saying, if we're going to send all of this money to Ukraine, why can't we take care of the border? Unfortunately, I think they got caught in a bit of gamesmanship, Steve, the Republicans, on this, because at some point Biden has weakened and said, well, we'll put money on the border. And the Republicans are saying, well, it's not just the money, we need policy changes. And the Democrats have balked at that. But I think we'll find the money for Ukraine in the near future, along with Israel, along with Taiwan. And I think that will move ahead. And I think there's a bipartisan commitment to do that. But in saying that, let me just ask, what is the end game? How long do you keep this trench to trench? And what's American responsibility vis-a-vis everybody else? If you can't cut a deal at some point and end it and get some kind of ceasefire, it's a complicated issue. These are legitimate questions to ask. But at this stage, I think there is a consensus in both parties that we need to move ahead with aid to Ukraine.
I sure pray that Tom is right. I do have my doubts. I believe that when you run on a platform of America first, you are emboldening isolationist tendencies within your own party. The Republican Party, which used to be the party of muscular diplomacy and support for national security and a bulwark against the spread of communism in Europe and Asia, is now increasingly an isolationist party in America. And when you have an isolationist party that is going up to their Republican member of Congress in a supermarket saying, who cares about Ukraine? I want to know what's happening on the border. Those members of Congress go back. It becomes much tougher for them to support the kind of aid that Ukraine needs. For me and many of my colleagues, including some Republicans, this is the most vivid demonstration of right versus wrong that we have witnessed in decades in the world, what Putin is doing in Ukraine. And if America is not willing to invest in the right and cedes the wrong to Putin, the results become unimaginable, which is why we're going to need to count on some Tom Davis Republicans, some responsible and reasonable and moderate Republicans to be the adults in the room and find enough Republican votes to join with 80 to 90 to 100% of Democrats in Congress who will support the continuation of robust aid, not only to Ukraine, but to Israel and to Taiwan.
Yeah, let me add, I do agree with him. So how do you mix these two together? There is no question that Trump, with his America First attitude, this is, by the way, not a new strain in American politics. This goes back to World War I, World War II. There's always been isolationist elements in the American population. Donald Trump has brought this to the fore as the leader of the party. He hasn't brought the party along with him yet. He has brought elements of that party, elements of that constituency along with him. But I think the leaders that are currently in the Congress understand what is at stake in the Ukraine and what is at stake with Putin. And I think it will get funded over the short term. Over the long term, like I said before, I don't think you can give a blank check forever to the Ukraine with everything else going on in the world and the other pressures in the U.S. So you asked me 2 years down the road, where is this going to be? If Ukraine refuses to sit down, for example, and say, we're not going to give an inch, we're going to continue to fight and get all the land, what is the response? I don't know where that goes. I honestly don't know where that is, but I can't believe there's a blank check forever with other issues in the world, in Taiwan, Middle East, and everything else. There's not enough money to go along with the deficits we're running, and we're entitled to ask some tough questions. But I think for the immediate future, I think we're going to get that funding there and stand behind Ukraine. And I agree with Steve that this is a right and wrong issue. It's an important issue for Europe to send Putin that message.
All right, one more question from the YouTube channel.
What do you think about Ted Cruz's theory about Michelle Obama replacing Biden as the nominee? Wouldn't this also theoretically solve the African-American problem and give Democrats a likable nominee?
Let me just say that we are not taking strategic advice from Ted Cruz. Let's just stipulate that from the beginning.
Let me just say that Michelle Obama is far too smart to want to run for the presidency.
Yeah, on the other hand, it would be a politically brilliant maneuver if they could work it out. But and that's the way Ted Cruz's mind works. But it's more theoretical, I think, than practical. It would be an interesting move, though, Steve. It would put the Republicans on defense right away.
It would be the kind of thing that Trump would do, actually.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
kind of maneuver. It's such a great reality
Trump
TV
will
show
pick her as
strategy.
vice presidential candidate. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Rhiannon, and I'm an exchange student here this year in Germany.
Where are you from?
I'm from Charleston, South Carolina.
Yay.
Okay.
So you already touched on this a little bit with Biden and the Democratic Party, but I was hoping that you could provide some insight on like the selection process for the Republicans and the Democrats regarding presidential candidates specifically. Mostly just because I remember when in the last election, when the insurrection happened, a lot of Republicans were actually turning against Trump and what he was saying, including my Senator Lindsey Graham. So I just wanted to ask about that, like maybe get some clarity on the selection process for each individual.
Well, look, I think the selection process is pretty set forward. The delegates to the National Convention are elected. New Hampshire, Haley picked up some delegates both in Iowa and in New Hampshire, in these early primaries. But South Carolina is next. I'll leave it to you to tell me where they stand in South Carolina. And Charleston may be her best area, because once you get to the upcountry, I think that is solidly Trump country. But the Tuesday after that, you go to Super Tuesday, where a lot of states are electing delegates. I don't think she has the finances to compete. I just don't see a way at this point that she stops Donald Trump from having the delegates he needs. Then what will happen is he will decide who he wants for a vice presidential nomination. That pick of his is subject to ratification by the delegates to that convention, and that can present a problem depending who the delegates are. For example, in 2008, John McCain wanted to pick Joe Lieberman. He wanted to put him and kind of say, I'm going to pick the Democratic candidate for vice president, but there was no way he could get that through a Republican convention. In fact, the Republican convention delegates, although pledged to McCain, were far more conservative than he was. And he ends up, as we know, with Sarah Palin to try to pacify the convention. I'm not sure what the convention delegates will look like this time. They were not particularly pro-Trump last time, but they were bound to Trump because he had won these primaries. The other thing I would say is the Democrats did switch out. Traditionally, we've had Iowa first and New Hampshire second, and then you move to South Carolina. But South Carolina was the primary that saved the presidency for Biden last time. It's what made him. He had run fourth, I think, in Iowa, or fifth in New Hampshire. He was kind of running well behind everybody before they got to South Carolina. And the African-American vote coalesced behind him. And the other Democrats decided after South Carolina, we've got to stop Bernie Sanders. And so they coalesced behind Biden as the person best able to stop Sanders and therefore beat Donald Trump. And it worked. So this time around, as kind of a thank you to Clyburn and recognizing that New Hampshire and Iowa are basically all white states, they put South Carolina first, which is why the Democrats didn't have a caucus in Iowa. And the New Hampshire primary did not pick any delegates. It was kind of a beauty contest that Biden didn't even participate in. But Biden will do obviously very well in South Carolina, given the makeup of that Democratic primary electorate, which on the Democratic side is, I think, majority African American. And he will be able to, he'll go to the convention, and I expect to get a repeat of what we had last time. That would be my take on it, Steve.
All right.
Mr. Davis, Mr. Israel, and I have a question about, the situation in Asia. I'm from China, and we've talked with Professor Gijswijt this morning about U.S.-China conflict in the future. And I wonder how will the states react when there is a regional conflict in Taiwan Strait, or even worse, a full-scale conflict between U.S. and China. And because of, the unclear national status of Taiwan in the international society, and even another thing is America is supporting Israel and Ukraine at the same time. And, this year is election year. And what if China make a bold move to take an operation?
That's a good question. So let me, it's a wonderful question, and let me try and address it. First of all, unlike Putin and the Kremlin, Beijing continues to have highly rational thinkers and strategists who make calculations based on the lowest risk possible. They are very proportionate, they are very careful, they calibrate. I believe that one of the positive byproducts of the robust Biden response to Ukraine has been a calculation in Beijing that it would not be a good idea to go into Taiwan. Putting aside all of the exceedingly difficult operational challenges that the PLA would have in an invasion of Taiwan, putting all of that aside, they have seen over the recent past, that when a power attacks another power on the basis of we own that territory, NATO responds, nations band together, funding is provided. Everybody thought that Zelensky, I shouldn't say everybody, but the conventional wisdom, certainly the conventional wisdom in the Kremlin, was that this is going to be over in 2 weeks. Yeah. And it's still going, and in fact accelerating now. Why? Because the international community responded in force with cohesion and cooperation and coordination. I believe that President Xi and others see that as a reason to continue to heighten and test, to continue to be competitive and with Blue Water Navy, to continue to challenge the United States, but not go over that red line. Now, what will happen in 5 years or 10 years remains to be seen. But I do believe that China has been rightfully deterred from any aggression against Taiwan based on the Biden policies in Ukraine, and Germany's policies in Ukraine, and NATO's policies in Ukraine.
So I substantially agree with Steve. But you're right to look at the vulnerabilities of the United States when you've got troops over in the Middle East, when you've got troops in Europe defending Ukraine. How stretched out could we be? And does China see militarily, is this a time to go after Taiwan? And we don't have a treaty with Taiwan that mandates we come in. I think we have what's called strategic ambiguity. It's enough, we think, to deter China. Look, our relations with China were pretty good until Xi came in and became a little more aggressive on the front. And Trump has responded to that by being more aggressive against China. And we're seeing some now, what was a very strong trade agreements, we're seeing them slacken a little bit. We're seeing factories being pulled out of China. We're seeing Chinese components now being barred from the United States in some case, recognizing that this relationship isn't what we had hoped and had envisioned. It's not warlike, but writers talk about Thucydides' trap in history, going back to Thucydides' commentaries on the Peloponnesian War, when you have the existing power and ascendant power and how they're treated each other. And I think, from both sides, we're still trying to think this out. It would clearly be, and China plays the long game, so I think it would not be smart for them to go in. I mean, the first thing you do is you mine the Taiwan Straits. It stops the Navy from coming. China would, at a minimum, get a very bloody nose, and internationally would be very disruptive to the kind of economy and and things they're trying to build for the Chinese. Militarily, it might make, I can understand why they would do that. And I understand with the elections in Taiwan this last time, why there is, on the Chinese part at this point, some nervousness over where that is going. I went over when President Ma was elected. He's from the other party, and I was there for his inauguration. I asked him, what's your relationship with China going to be in 15 years? And he basically said, well, that's up to China. But we saw how China handled Hong Kong, that it was going to be one nation, two systems. But China wanted one nation, one system. I think the Taiwanese saw this and saw that the freedom that they're getting right now, they would not get with the Chinese regime. And where they might have been able to close amicably at one point, at least at this point, that looks to be a long way off. So it's anybody's guess. I don't know what Trump would do if they invaded Taiwan. I'm not sure she knows either. Maybe that's a good thing, because nobody wants to risk the kind of war these two superpowers what this would do to the world. I don't think rational people want to see that happen. But I understand the Chinese goal of unification over the long term, and I think it has to be handled very delicately.
Can I add one quick thing?
Please.
So I run the Cornell University Institute of Politics and Global Affairs, and we do series of very high-level war games and tabletop simulations, where we bring some of the smartest military thinkers, strategists, tacticians together with members of Congress and the defense establishment. And our most recent war game was China and Taiwan in a kinetic confrontation. And one of the things we learned was it's really hard for China to pull this off swiftly and awesomely. It's much more difficult than people think. This is a lesson that Israel is learning in Gaza, and I fully support Israel's policies. This is a lesson that Putin is learning in Ukraine. This is a lesson that I believe Beijing already understands.
Right, we have time for a couple more questions. I thought we've had a little bit of a foreign policy block now. Let's briefly intervene here with a question that I think we need to address with two experts here in the room, and that is, you already mentioned it, all those indictments that seem to be hanging around Trump's neck. You, Tom, indicated that you believe that some of these are politically motivated, but let's have a quick indication whether you believe these legal troubles will have an impact on the election. What if Trump is really convicted of crimes? There seem to be some Republicans who will not vote for him in that case. Maybe a quick indication.
Yeah, I don't think a conviction helps him. I'm not sure how bad it hurts him to, like in New York City, where he gets 17% of the vote, or Washington D.C., where he gets 6% of the vote, and you know what the jury pool is. But I don't think a conviction ever helps anybody. But what we have seen is these indictments have basically united that Republican base, because if they've seen the leader of this movement assaulted by the left. Indictment, I think some polling shows could have an adverse effect, but Trump's strategy is pretty clear. He wants to put off these trials till after the election. We're doing appeal after appeal, and the one that was most likely to come off was in a state case by a Democratic prosecutor in Georgia. And now they've uncovered that she was having an affair with one of her assistants, and that's going to be investigated. And Trump is, he's, if nothing else, very tactical about gumming up the works and at least trying to push this stuff out. I'd add two things. If he is convicted in New York or Georgia, he can't pardon himself. If he's convicted in the two federals, I think there's an argument that he might be able to get out of it. But a state court conviction stays with him, as would a jail sentence. So this has got to play out. It's very clumsy. I mean, we've never seen this in America before. I am absolutely convinced that New York case, for example, is completely political. This is a brand new legal theory, has never been tried before, but you have basically a district attorney who runs on, I'm going to get Donald Trump. That's his whole campaign. So if he's going to find a crime to fit it. The documents case is a little more complicated. Hillary Clinton had problems, if you remember, with her emails and destroying some of the evidence, and the FBI head saying, well, they were technically violations, but you wouldn't, a prosecutor wouldn't indict. And these are judgment calls that I think will work themselves out down the road. And in Florida, you have a Republican judge down there that I think is going to probably kick this thing off until after the election. Mm-hmm. That's my read on it very quickly.
I'll just add to that, just to specifically talk about the impact on the election. Remember the magic numbers here. Remember 40% locked into Biden, 40% locked into Trump. What about the 20% in those 7 states? Those voters tune all this out. They're not paying attention to the indictments. They're not paying attention to the impeachment of Joe Biden or Hunter Biden. They're not political. They're not ideological. They're paying attention to their economy. They're paying attention to their paychecks. They're paying attention to whether their kids are going to be able to afford to go to college. And so I don't believe that these issues really will impact the election in that segment of the electorate unless there is a conviction. And if there is a conviction, that further drives them to Joe Biden. They may think the indictments are political, they're not even sure what they're about, but if there is a conviction, they view it as, okay, the system worked, a jury, a court, a judge convicted him, and I just don't have much of an appetite for a convicted felon to be the next president of the United States.
On the other hand, if he were to get acquitted.
And if he's acquitted, it works the other way.
It works the other way.
Yeah.
Thank you, and good evening to Mr. Israel and Mr. Davis. And my question is about what Mr. Israel had talked about for the entire evening, the so-called lock-in base 40% for the Democratic Party. And because I recently read a news report from Politico, a very trustworthy news outlet, in my opinion, and it said that Biden's approval rating, not approval rating, but the percent of Black African-American voters who wanted to vote for Biden had dropped from the previous 80% to right now it's hanging in 56%, with 20 or so going to RFK Jr. And I also recently watched another video from Vox News, which he talked about Michigan, where it had the largest Arab American population there, and a lot of them who vote for Biden. Obviously, it's the so-called Aryan voters, a Chinese term we used to call the voters who are determined to vote for one party instead of the other. They are seeing that Arab Americans are really not wanting to vote for either of them. So my question is how, and also there are radical lefts in American terms. So those Bernie Sanders voters, although Bernie Sanders endorsed Hillary, Biden, but the voters for Bernie Sanders didn't follow their leader, so they didn't vote for Hillary in 2016, which is a part of why Hillary lost. So my question is for Mr. Israel is how to win those Aryan voters back, and for Mr. Davis is how to, since the Republicans are less likely to win them over, how to make them not vote.
So let's break this down. First of all, the polling that you've seen, I've seen, but again, that polling is based on what is happening today. I'm not interested in what's happening today. I want to know how those folks feel in October. If Israel and other issues, Gaza, have receded in the headlines, then the data changes measurably. So let's just factor out what attitudinal surveys you're reading now, because now is not October. Secondly, it is true that the Democratic Party is witnessing an erosion of support from African American voters, from Latinx voters, and that is something that we're going to address. But again, you're factoring into that super progressive African American voters and Latinx voters in, say, Brooklyn, New York. Biden's going to win New York. I want to know what's happening with those voters in those 7 battleground states. That is what's pertinent. Not what's happening with them in Texas. Well, maybe Texas isn't a great example, but not what's happening with them in California or New York or Alabama. Final point on this is that it is true that highly progressive, mostly young people in the electorate are antagonized right now by President Biden's policies towards Israel. Policies that I support 600%, by the way. But who cares what I think? You want to know what they think. The diminution of support for the Democrats among those progressives matters in those 7 battleground states, and 2 in particular that I would mention. Michigan, for example. So to win Michigan, Joe Biden has to have very robust turnout at the University of Michigan, Michigan State, and with progressives in Detroit. If those numbers are underwhelming, it's going to be harder for him to win Michigan. And if he's not winning Michigan, where else is he going to go? He has to go shopping to replace Michigan in the Electoral College. Where? It's going to be tough. The other state I would look at is Minnesota. Minnesota, I don't believe it's a battleground state right now. I wouldn't put it in that category. But it could be a battleground state if the Arab American population in Minnesota, which is significant, is also turned off to President Biden based on his policies towards Israel. Now, I don't believe that they would vote for Trump. Arab American voters or African American voters, progressive voters, they're not voting for Trump. Question is, do they stay home or do they vote for a third party? And that's something that the Biden campaign is going to have to address as we get closer to Election Day.
So it's hard to get excited about Joe Biden. I mean, the guy gives a fireside chat and the fire goes out. I mean, that's just the way it goes. He was elected basically because people were tired of having Donald Trump in their living room and didn't want him there 4 more years. They were tired of the noise. They were tired of the drama. They were tired of the tweets. Now Biden's had 4 years, and they've seen that instead of centering himself, he's stayed on the left, but not left enough for some people. He's the first president for a while that hasn't had somebody from the opposite party in their cabinet, for example. Donald Trump had Democrats in his cabinet. So, and as I said, people, they don't like either one. If you look at Biden's favorable, unfavorable, look at his very favorable and his very unfavorable. It's like 3-1 unfavorable. But Biden is there as the vehicle to stop Trump. and Trump is there. He's got a stronger base, if you will, but he's there his message is to stop the movement forward to this progressive part of the country. So he's there basically to stop Biden. I don't know how this works out at the end. I think that's why you have political campaigns. Biden's got a capable team. Trump, this time, unlike the last two times, has a very capable campaign team. But they're very flawed candidates. This will be probably the two least popular candidates in history to run again, which is why you have this proliferation of other candidates. And I wouldn't venture a prediction in terms of what happens between now and November. My advice to Donald Trump, if I'm giving advice, is stay on message. Just stop popping off.
Good luck.
Stop the tweets. Good luck. Exactly. And for Joe Biden is read the script. When he goes off script at this point, he's always having to experience. We talked about Taiwan. He was all over the map on Taiwan. He said, we'll defend Taiwan. Then his office says, no, he's not going to do, we haven't committed to that, and back and forth. They need to stay basically on their script at this point. Trump won in 2016 in the last 3 weeks because three things happened. People forget this. Number one, the FBI reopened the investigation on Hillary's emails, remember? Mm-hmm. Number two, the Obamacare premiums came out and they were higher than projected. And third, Donald Trump just read from the teleprompter. He didn't pop off the last 3 weeks. It gave people, well, maybe this guy's not what we thought. But these guys, look, both of them have huge flaws with parts of the electorate at this point. And I think it'll come down to, are people, if Donald Trump is the issue as you move into November, he loses. If Biden's the issue, he'll lose at this point. The public's never going to love these two guys, but it's what it is.
All right, let's take 2 or 3 sort of joint last questions. We're running out of time.
Sure.
Yep.
We are very grateful for you taking the time, but we also want to be mindful of the time that's been allotted to the event and of your busy schedules. So 2 final questions. I think you guys have had your hands up. Yeah.
My question is actually about foreign policies again, and this time it's about India, because I think it's really interesting that when we're talking about American politics, we always talk about polarization, and that Biden and Trump often disagree, but both endorse a stronger relationship with India. And my question would be, how do you feel about Modi's really strong and radical Hindu nationalist and anti-Muslim policy in terms of endorsing such a relationship? And if the American public actually cares more about like security and economy in terms of India being the only other great power in the Indo-Pacific district despite China.
All right, can I cut you off here? We're going to collect a couple of questions. I believe India is a little bit outside of the comfort zone of our
it's okay.
guests here. We'll
it's a
see.
question.
But let's have 2 more, and then we can sort of wrap it up in one big final round.
Thank you. My question would be to I'd like to invite you to sort of fantasize if there were a couple of things you could overnight change about the political system or the structure of society in the US. Since we talked a lot about polarization and the sort of gridlock that there seems to be no way out, what would those things be for both of you?
You want to? Okay. Oh, there's a third.
My question is very simple. What could either stop Donald Trump or Joe Biden? As a very last question, because it's about these 20% that you guys are always saying, 40% are decided already, but what could stop it? I believe it's probably got to do something with teleprompter, maybe reading the script, but let's see.
Too many cheeseburgers.
Yeah, I mean, you got to remember, I'll start with the third one first, that Kamala Harris is less popular than Joe Biden. And I think each party is, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but I think they're stuck with their candidate. And I think they need to make the most of that. And I think the American public, these campaigns are going to be a race to the bottom. I think they're going to be highly negative campaigns going against the other one, where the public's not going to like anyone at the end, which gives you some rationale that at the end, maybe a no-labels party or somebody could come up at the end and say, I'm not one of these guys, give me a chance. It's happened rarely in American politics, but it's happened. I'd run a more positive bent if I were Biden and run like a Morning in America, like things are getting better, like Reagan did. But there's still a long way to go on this and to see where that goes. As far as India, I think what Modi is doing, we're seeing this across the globe as people double down on their religious and cultural bases. I think it's the worst kind of polarization that you can get in politics. I don't think America is going to touch it as far as we go, but it's politics that appears to work in many of these areas. You double down on a base. A government doesn't last very long when one group's in control and you exclude a wide amount of other people. Government, I was in local government. I was the head of my local government, 1 million people in Fairfax, Virginia. We got things done because everybody was invited into the table for their suggestions. Not everybody won, but they went away knowing they had their say, they got their face time, and everybody felt invested in the outcome. And we didn't hate each other. But today's model is we have a coalition over here in the Republican Party, which is one group of people. We have a coalition on the Democratic side. We win, you lose. And it's not a good country when you have 40% of the country rooting against you because you're rooting against the country because you don't like the leader. So I'm one that believes in more inclusive leadership. That doesn't seem to be the current model that's being offered by both parties. In terms of, I think Steve and I would agree, one of the major changes we could make in America today is take the drawing of congressional districts and legislative districts out of the hands of legislators and give them to commissions or courts. Yeah. It's when politicians get to choose their own voters, bad things happen.
So on what could stop Trump and what could stop Biden, I give the same answer, the economy. If the economy is doing well and those voters in those battleground states feel that there's progress and they don't want to go back to the chaos of Donald Trump, Trump is stopped. If the economy is not doing well and those voters think about, well, you know, maybe Trump is a better deal because he's going to stand up for, you know, to unfair trade deals and he's going to stop these migrants from coming in and taking away our jobs and lowering our wages, then Biden gets stopped. James Carville, the Democratic political strategist who helped elect Bill Clinton, famously said, "It's the economy, stupid." And I believe that in November, it will still be the economy. On the question of improvements, fully agree with Tom. Right now, I gave you the statistics, 125 moderate districts when I was elected, 20, 30 today because of redistricting. Improvement 1, reform 1, stop partisan redistricting, make districts more in the center so that people like Tom Davis and Steve Israel can compromise and govern. Number 2, stop the overt opinionization of cable news by reinstating something that we had in the United States called the Fairness Doctrine. We used to require network news to present both sides of a story. That Fairness Doctrine was repealed by Ronald Reagan. It was not reinstated when it should have by Barack Obama. People are getting news based on silos, on verticals. We need more fairness. Improvement number 3 is more social media literacy so that people know that when they're getting content from their devices, it's by algorithm, it's malevolent, it's designed not to give them information, but to get the adrenaline and the anger flowing. And then finally, I think we have to, the improvement long-term is, we've got to reorient America's education system so that there is more of a priority on civic engagement. I mean, we literally have to teach our young people in America how to engage responsibly and respectfully again, and the basics of civic engagement in the United States. These are long-term issues that will follow whoever wins in November, and they actually predate whoever won in 2020 and 2016. But these are issues that are a result of some unique convergence of socioeconomic pressures, not only in the United States, but in Germany and elsewhere, and they're going to need to be addressed over the long term, I believe. Oh, India. I'm sorry, India. Look, and I'm not speaking for the Biden administration at all on this. I'm not involved in U.S. foreign policy. I think the Biden administration will exercise realpolitik and geostrategic viability. They will continue to understand the importance of India vis-a-vis Pakistan, vis-a-vis China, throughout the region. And while they will condemn authoritarian abuses and human rights violations in India, they will continue to understand that India does play a very important role geostrategically. And we'll have to kind of balance, in my view, we'll need to balance those tensions and conflicts.
All right. Thank you both for fascinating insights. A very interesting evening. I think we could talk for much longer. We haven't even discussed the Supreme Court and the overturning of Roe v. Wade. But our time is more than up. We're 10 minutes over time already, so I'm afraid that I do have to stop the conversation here. I'm sure the conversation will continue on the way out in the bus, etc. Your conversations here in Germany will continue tomorrow for your next stop, and I want to thank you so much for doing this, for coming here, crossing the Atlantic, and having these discussions with us here. So thank you both. Thank you for all those great questions and for coming tonight. And I hope to see you soon again here in the d.a.i. Felix, last word.
Thank you.
On behalf of the German-American Institute, I'd like to thank Sophia Kumlo, who had the most stressful, or one of the most stressful jobs tonight. I'd like to thank everyone for attending. I'd like again to thank the US Embassy and the US Consulates for making this happen. Thank you, Thomas, for leading us through the night. And thank you so much, Steve and Tom, for doing this whole tour, coming to Germany, answering so many questions, going over time with us. Thank you so much, and have a great night.